The mountain wind howled through the pines as Ruth Collins pressed her back against the rough bark of an ancient oak, her breath coming in sharp gasps that crystallized in the bitter air. Blood seeped through the torn fabric of her dress, where thorns had caught her during her desperate flight through the forest. Her hand instinctively moved to protect the gentle swell of her belly, where new life grew despite the chaos surrounding her. The scars that crisscrossed her face and arms throbbed in the cold, reminders of the fire that had taken everything from her 6 months ago. Everything except the child she carried and the fierce determination that burned in her chest like an ember refusing to die. Behind her, voices echoed through the trees, growing closer with each passing moment. Mr. Thompson's voice cut through the night air like a blade, commanding his men to spread out, to find her before she could reach the safety of the high country. She had overheard their plan in the darkness outside the boarding house where she had been staying, using the last of her meager savings to keep a roof over her head. They meant to take her back to town, to force her into an arrangement that would strip away what little dignity she had left. Ruth closed her eyes for a moment, remembering the feel of gentle fingers tracing the scars on her cheek just hours before. The way James Ramos had looked at her was something that might have been tenderness. She had fled from him too, unable to believe that anyone could see past the damaged surface to whatever remained of the woman beneath. But now, as the sound of approaching footsteps grew louder, she found herself wishing she had stayed, wishing she had been brave enough to trust in the quiet strength she had seen in his dark eyes. The forest around her seemed to pulse with hidden life, every shadow potentially concealing either salvation or danger. She had been running for what felt like hours, following animal trails and creek beds deeper into the wilderness that stretched endlessly toward the distant peaks. Her feet were numb inside her worn boots, and exhaustion pulled at her limbs like chains, but she forced herself to keep moving. A branch snapped somewhere to her left, and Ruth's heart hammered against her ribs as she peered into the darkness. The moon provided only scattered light through the thick canopy overhead, creating a patchwork of silver and shadow that made it impossible to distinguish between the shapes of trees and the silhouettes of men. The memory of how this nightmare had begun played through her mind like a cruel theater performance. She had been sitting by the small fire in the boarding house common room, mending a tear in her only decent dress, when she had heard Mr. Thompson's voice drifting from the next room. He had been speaking to someone about arrangements, about a woman who owed debts she could never repay. The story of how Ruth Collins found herself fleeing through a mountain forest begins 3 weeks earlier, when she first arrived in the small mining town of Cedar Falls, with nothing but the clothes on her back and a heart full of desperate hope. The stagecoach had deposited her at the edge of town on a gray afternoon in late autumn. Ruth had climbed down from the dusty interior with careful movements, one hand supporting her lower back where the long journey had left her aching. The other passengers had given her a wide berth during the trip, their eyes lingering on the scars that marked her face and hands before quickly looking away. She had stood on the wooden sidewalk for a long moment, taking in the collection of weathered buildings that made up the town's main street. Cedar Falls was smaller than she had hoped, but it was far enough from her previous life that no one would know her story unless she chose to tell it. Mrs. Patterson, the boarding house keeper, had looked her up and down with the practiced eye of someone who had seen every variety of human misfortune pass through her doors. The older woman's gaze had lingered on Ruth's scars, but there had been no cruelty in her expression, only a wary kind of understanding. "I have a small room upstairs," Mrs. Patterson had said. "It is not much, but it is clean and warm. The rate is $2 a week, payable in advance." Ruth had counted out the money from her small purse, watching her savings dwindle with each coin she placed on the counter. She had enough for perhaps 3 weeks, maybe 4 if she was careful about meals. The room had been exactly as advertised, small and simple, but mercifully private. A narrow bed, a washstand, and a single window that looked out over the town's main street. Ruth had set her few belongings on the dresser and sat heavily on the edge of the bed, finally allowing herself to acknowledge the bone-deep exhaustion that had been her constant companion for months. Her journey to Cedar Falls had been long and circuitous, a series of train rides and stagecoach connections that had taken her steadily westward from the ruins of her former life. The fire had happened on a night much like this one, when the wind was howling and the air was sharp with the promise of winter. She had been sleeping when the smell of smoke had awakened her, and by the time she had fully comprehended the danger, flames were already licking at the walls of the small house she had shared with her husband. Thomas had been working late in his study, as he often did, poring over the ledgers from his struggling general store. Ruth had called out to him as she fought her way through the smoke-filled hallway, but there had been no answer. The beam that had fallen across her back and arms had trapped her for precious minutes, the burning wood searing through her dress and into her flesh. She had somehow found the strength to push it aside and continue dragging Thomas towards safety, but by the time she had gotten him outside, it was too late. The physical scars had healed, after a fashion, but the deeper wounds had proven more persistent. The townspeople had been kind enough in their way, offering sympathy and small donations to help her through the immediate aftermath. But as the weeks had passed and it became clear that she was carrying Thomas's child, the nature of their assistance had begun to change. There had been suggestions about arrangements that could be made, about families who might be willing to take in both mother and child in exchange for certain services. Ruth had understood what they were really offering, and the knowledge had filled her with a cold determination to find another way. She had sold what few possessions had survived the fire, gathered what money she could, and set out for the territories where she hoped to build something new. Cedar Falls had seemed like a place where such a thing might be possible. For the first few days, this had proven largely true. She had walked the streets looking for work, enduring the stares and whispered comments with as much dignity as she could muster. Most of the shopkeepers had been polite but firm in their refusals. A few had been less kind, making it clear that they did not want someone with her appearance representing their establishments. It was on the fourth day that she had first encountered James Ramos. She had been sitting on a bench outside the general store when she had noticed him watching her from across the street. He was a tall man with dark hair and weathered features that spoke of a life spent outdoors. What had struck her most about him was the way he looked at her. There was no pity in his gaze, no disgust or uncomfortable fascination with her scars. Over the following days, she had begun to notice him more frequently. He seemed to appear wherever she was looking for work, always at a distance, always watching with that same thoughtful expression. The truth had become clear on the evening when Mr. Thompson had first approached her at the boarding house. Ruth had been sitting in the common room trying to make her meager dinner last as long as possible when the well-dressed man had settled into the chair across from her without invitation. "I have been hearing about your situation," he had said, his voice carrying the smooth confidence of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted. "It seems to me that a woman in your condition might be interested in discussing certain arrangements that could prove mutually beneficial." Ruth had felt her stomach clench with dread even before he had outlined his proposal. He owned several establishments in town, he had explained, places where a woman could earn good money providing companionship and entertainment to the miners and travelers who passed through Cedar Falls. The implication had been clear enough, and Ruth had felt bile rise in her throat as she had struggled to maintain her composure. She had thanked him politely for his offer and excused herself from the table. But his words had followed her up the stairs to her room like a physical weight. That night, she had lain awake staring at the ceiling and trying to calculate how many days she had left before her money ran out completely. The arithmetic was unforgiving, and no matter how she arranged the numbers, they pointed toward the same inevitable conclusion. It was then that she had heard the soft knock at her door. When she had opened the door, she had found James Ramos standing in the hallway, his hat in his hands and his expression serious but not threatening. "Mrs. Collins," he had said, his voice low and respectful, "I hope you will forgive the intrusion, but I wanted to speak with you about something that might be of interest." Ruth had hesitated in the doorway, acutely aware of her nightgown and the impropriety of speaking with a strange man in such circumstances. But there had been something in his manner that had suggested this was not a social call, and curiosity had overcome her caution. James had remained standing near the entrance, his presence filling the small space without overwhelming it. When his gaze had returned to her face, there had been no judgment in his expression, only the same thoughtful assessment she had noticed before. "I have a cabin up in the mountains," he had said without preamble. "It is a good day's ride from here, far enough from town that a person could live quietly without interference from others. I am in need of someone to keep house and help with various tasks around the property." Ruth had stared at him in surprise, uncertain whether to believe what she was hearing. The offer seemed too good to be true, too perfectly suited to her desperate circumstances. "Why me?" she had asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "You do not know anything about me, about what I have done or where I have come from." James had been quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes studying her face with that same careful attention. When he had finally spoken, his words had carried the weight of absolute certainty. "I know enough," he had said simply. "I know that you are running from something that was not your fault, and I know that you are stronger than you believe yourself to be. I know that you need a place to heal, and I need someone I can trust to share my home." The conversation had continued for another hour, with James outlining the practical details of his proposal. The cabin was well built and comfortable, he had assured her, with all the necessities for a simple but decent life. There was a garden that needed tending, meals that needed cooking, and various household tasks that would keep her occupied without being overwhelming. There had been no mention of payment in the traditional sense, no discussion of wages or formal employment. Instead, James had spoken of partnership, of two people helping each other survive in a harsh and unforgiving world. Ruth had wanted to accept immediately, but years of hard experience had taught her to be wary of offers that seemed too generous. She had asked for time to consider his proposal, and James had nodded his understanding before taking his leave. The decision had been made easier by Mr. Thompson's second visit. He had cornered her outside the general store the next afternoon, his polished smile replaced by something harder and more direct. He had made it clear that his offer would not remain open indefinitely, and that her continued presence in town was becoming something of an inconvenience. Ruth had returned to the boarding house that evening with her mind made up. When James had knocked on her door at the appointed time, she had been ready with her answer. She had accepted his offer with gratitude and relief. They had left Cedar Falls before dawn 2 days later, loading Ruth's few belongings into a sturdy wagon, along with supplies for the journey. The ride into the mountains had taken most of the day, following winding trails that climbed steadily higher through forests of pine and aspen. The cabin, when they had finally reached it, had exceeded her expectations in every way. It was larger than James had suggested, built from solid logs and fitted with glass windows that would let in the morning light. There was a stone fireplace that dominated one wall of the main room, and a kitchen area equipped with everything necessary for preparing meals. James had shown her around the property with obvious pride, pointing out the well that provided fresh water, the smokehouse for preserving meat, and the garden plot that would need attention come spring. The whole setup spoke of careful planning and patient work, the kind of place that could sustain a small family through even the harshest winters. That first evening, as they had shared a simple meal by the fireplace, Ruth had finally begun to believe that she might have found a place where she could build something resembling a life. What had surprised Ruth most about their arrangement was how natural it had felt almost from the beginning. James had treated her with a respect and consideration that she had not experienced since her husband's death, speaking to her as an equal rather than a charity case or an object of pity. The child she carried had begun to show more prominently as the weeks had passed, and James had adjusted their routine accordingly without being asked. He had taken over the heavier tasks around the cabin and had made sure she always had a comfortable place to sit when they shared their evening meals. It was during the third week of their arrangement that Ruth had begun to notice changes in the way James looked at her. The careful assessment she had observed in town had given way to something warmer and more personal, though he had been careful never to make her uncomfortable with unwanted attention. The realization that she was developing feelings for him had come as a shock to Ruth. She had assumed that part of her life was over, that no man would ever see past her scars to the woman beneath. But there had been moments when the attraction between them had been impossible to ignore. Times when their hands had brushed while working together, or when she had looked up from her task to find him watching her with undisguised warmth. The breaking point had come on a cold evening when a storm had swept down from the peaks, bringing with it wind and rain that had rattled the windows and sent smoke back down the chimney. Ruth had been struggling to adjust the damper when James had moved to help her, his body close behind hers as they had worked together to solve the problem. When she had turned to thank him, she had found herself trapped between his arms and the stone hearth, close enough to see the gold flecks in his dark eyes. For a moment, they had simply looked at each other, the air between them charged with all the unspoken feelings that had been building for weeks. James had reached up slowly, his fingers barely touching the scars that crossed her left cheek. His touch had been so gentle that she had barely felt it, but the emotion behind the gesture had been unmistakable. "These do not define you," he had said softly, his thumb tracing the raised line of scar tissue with infinite tenderness. "You are beautiful, Ruth Collins, scars and all." The words had hit her like a physical blow, not because they were cruel, but because they were kind. She had pulled away from him with a sharp intake of breath, her hand flying to her cheek as if to hide the marks he had just touched with such reverence. "You do not know what you are saying," she had whispered, her voice shaking with emotion. "You cannot possibly mean that." James had stepped back immediately, giving her space but not breaking eye contact. His expression had been serious but not angry, as if he had expected her reaction and was prepared to be patient with her fear. "I mean every word," he had said simply. "I have been watching you for weeks, Ruth. I have seen your strength, your kindness, your determination to build something good from the ashes of whatever happened to you before." Ruth had wanted to believe him, had felt something deep in her chest unfurling like a flower reaching towards sunlight. But the voice of doubt that had been her constant companion since the fire had been too strong to overcome. "You are being kind," she had said, her voice barely audible over the sound of the storm outside. "But kindness is not the same thing as truth, and I will not be the object of your pity." She had fled to her room then, leaving James standing by the fireplace with an expression of such genuine hurt that it had made her chest ache with regret. That had been 3 days ago, and the tension between them had been unbearable ever since. James had continued to be courteous and helpful, but there had been a distance in his manner that had made Ruth feel as if she were slowly freezing from the inside out. Instead, she had thrown herself into preparations for a trip to town to purchase supplies before the worst of the winter weather set in. James had planned to make the journey alone, but Ruth had insisted on accompanying him. The trip to Cedar Falls had started well enough, with James maintaining his usual quiet competence as they had navigated the mountain trails. They had conducted their business in town efficiently, purchasing flour and coffee and other necessities that would see them through the winter months. It was while they were loading their purchases into the wagon that Ruth had overheard the conversation that had changed everything. Two men had been talking in low voices near the general store, their words carrying clearly in the crisp afternoon air. "Thompson is getting impatient," one had said. "He says the woman has had long enough to come to her senses, and if she will not cooperate willingly, then other arrangements will need to be made." Ruth had felt the blood drain from her face as the implications of their words had sunk in. Mr. Thompson had not given up on his plans for her, and he was apparently prepared to use force if necessary to ensure her cooperation. James had noticed her distress immediately, his eyes following her gaze toward the two men who were still talking in low voices. His expression had hardened as he had apparently reached the same conclusion about their conversation. "We need to leave," he had said quietly, his voice carrying an urgency that had made her stomach clench with fresh fear. "Now, before they notice us." They had finished loading the wagon in tense silence, both of them aware that they were being watched by eyes that meant them no good. James had helped Ruth onto the wagon seat with careful efficiency, and they had left town at a pace that was just short of running. The men had followed them, just as she had feared they would. James had spotted them first, his sharp eyes picking out the movement in the trees behind them as their wagon had climbed the winding trail toward home. There had been at least 4 of them, possibly more, riding hard to close the distance. James had pushed the horses as hard as he dared on the treacherous mountain trail, but the wagon was heavy with supplies and could not match the speed of men on horseback. It had become clear that they would be overtaken long before they could reach the safety of the cabin. "You have to run," he had told her, as he had pulled the wagon to a stop in a small clearing. "Take the trail that leads up toward the ridge, the one I showed you last week. Follow it until you reach the old mining camp. Then wait for me there." Ruth had stared at him in horror, understanding immediately what he was planning to do. He meant to face their pursuers alone, to buy her time to escape by sacrificing his own safety. "I will not leave you," she had said, her voice shaking with emotion. "We can face this together, whatever comes." James had looked at her with an expression of such fierce protectiveness that it had taken her breath away. "You will go," he had said, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "Ulsa, you will go because that child you carry deserves a chance at life, and because I cannot protect you if I am worried about your safety." She had wanted to argue, but the sound of approaching hoofbeats had made the decision for them, and James had practically lifted her down from the wagon seat before pointing toward the trail that led up into the deeper forest. "Go," he had said, pressing something into her hand as she had stood frozen with indecision. "Do not look back, and do not stop until you reach the mining camp. I will find you there when this is over." Ruth had looked down to find his pocket watch in her palm, the silver surface warm from his body heat. The gesture had been so intimate, so full of unspoken promise, that she had felt tears spring to her eyes. Instead, she had turned and run, crashing through the underbrush like a wild thing as the sound of men's voices had echoed behind her. She had heard James calling out a greeting to their pursuers, his voice calm and steady, as if he were welcoming neighbors rather than facing men who meant him harm. That had been hours ago, and Ruth was still running, still climbing higher into the wilderness as the voices of her pursuers echoed through the trees behind her. She had lost the trail twice in the darkness, forced to backtrack and search for the faint path that would lead her to the abandoned mining camp where James had promised to find her. A shout from somewhere below and to her left made Ruth freeze against the trunk of the oak tree, her heart hammering so loudly she was certain it would give away her position. The voice was closer than she had expected, close enough that she could make out individual words carried on the cold mountain air. "She went this way," the voice called, rough with exertion and frustration. "Thompson wants her brought back alive," but he did not say anything about unharmed. The casual cruelty in the man's tone made Ruth's stomach turn with revulsion and fear. She pressed her face against the rough bark of the tree, trying to make herself as small as possible, while her mind raced through her limited options. The sound of breaking branches grew closer, accompanied by the low murmur of voices as the searchers spread out through the forest. Ruth could hear at least 3 distinct voices, which meant that at least one man had stayed behind to deal with James. The thought made her chest tight with anguish. Moving as quietly as she could manage, Ruth eased away from the oak tree and deeper into the forest. The undergrowth was thick here, full of thorns and fallen branches that caught at her dress and made every step treacherous. She had gone perhaps 100 yards when she heard the sound that made her blood run cold. A man's voice, much closer than the others, speaking in the kind of low, patient tone used by hunters who had cornered their prey. "I know you are out there," the voice said, carrying clearly through the still air. "There is nowhere to run up here, nowhere to hide that we will not eventually find you." Ruth crouched behind a fallen log, her breathing shallow and rapid as she tried to pinpoint the location of the speaker. He sounded as if he was perhaps 50 yards away, somewhere off to her right where the forest opened into a small meadow she had crossed earlier. The man continued speaking, his voice carrying practiced patience. "You are carrying Bushwald, which means you cannot run forever. The cold will get to you long before you reach any kind of help." His words hit their target with devastating accuracy. Ruth's hand moved instinctively to her belly, where the child stirred restlessly as if responding to her elevated heart rate. She was already exhausted from hours of running, and the temperature was dropping steadily as the night wore on. But the alternative was unthinkable, and Ruth found herself remembering the gentle way James had traced her scars, the absolute certainty in his voice when he had told her she was beautiful. She thought of the life they might have built together in the mountain cabin. Ruth began moving again, using the fallen log as cover while she worked her way toward what she hoped was the continuation of the trail. The forest floor was carpeted with pine needles that muffled her footsteps, but every small sound seemed magnified in the stillness of the night. Behind her, the voices of the searchers grew more organized, as if they were coordinating their efforts to cover more ground systematically. Ruth realized with growing despair that they were driving her towards something, herding her like livestock toward a predetermined destination. The realization that she was walking into a trap filled Ruth with a desperation that bordered on panic. She veered off the trail and into the thickest part of the forest, where towering pines grew so close together that their branches formed an almost impenetrable canopy overhead. It was in this maze of trees and shadows that Ruth finally heard the sound she had been both longing for and dreading. A man's voice calling her name, but not in the threatening tones of her pursuers. This voice was familiar, warm with concern and edged with an urgency that made her heart leap with desperate hope. "Ruth," James called, his voice echoing through the forest from somewhere ahead and to her left. "Ruth, where are you? Answer me if you can hear this." The sound of his voice filled her with such relief that she nearly cried out in response before caution stopped her. But as the voice called again, closer this time, and filled with an emotion that could not be faked, Ruth knew with absolute certainty that it was him. Ruth began moving toward the sound of his voice, abandoning stealth in favor of speed as she crashed through the undergrowth. Behind her, she could hear shouts as her pursuers realized what was happening and changed direction to intercept her. "James," she called, her voice cracking with emotion and exhaustion. "James, I am here." The response was immediate and electrifying. Ruth heard the sound of someone moving rapidly through the forest, breaking branches and sending small rocks skittering down the hillside in his haste to reach her. A moment later, James emerged from the darkness like a figure from a dream, his clothes torn and his face streaked with dirt, but his eyes blazing with relief and determination. "Oi, Ruth," he said, catching her in his arms as she stumbled toward him. "Thank God you are safe. I was afraid I would not find you in time." She collapsed against his chest, her legs finally giving out after hours of running in terror. James held her close, one hand stroking her hair, while the other supported her weight with gentle strength. But the illusion was shattered by the sound of approaching voices, closer now and filled with the excitement of hunters who had finally cornered their prey. James tensed against her, his arms tightening protectively as he scanned the darkness around them. "How many?" Ruth whispered, her voice barely audible against his chest. "3 now," James replied grimly. "I managed to convince one of them that pursuing us was not in his best interest, but the others are more determined. We need to keep moving." He helped her to her feet, his hands gentle but urgent as he assessed her condition in the dim light. Ruth could see concern in his expression as he took in her torn dress and the scratches that covered her arms. "Can you walk?" he asked, his voice soft with worry. "The mining camp is not far now, but the trail is rough and we will need to move quickly." Ruth nodded, drawing on reserves of strength she had not known she possessed. The knowledge that James was with her, that they were facing this danger together, made everything seem possible. They moved in silence for what felt like hours, climbing steadily higher into the mountains as the voices of their pursuers faded behind them. James set a pace that was challenging, but not impossible, frequently checking to make sure Ruth was managing the difficult terrain. The mining camp, when they finally reached it, was a collection of abandoned buildings huddled in a small valley between two ridges. The structures were in various states of decay, but they offered shelter and concealment, and James led Ruth to the most intact of the buildings with obvious relief. Inside the old bunkhouse, James quickly built a small fire in the stone hearth, using dry wood he had apparently stored there for such emergencies. The flames cast dancing shadows on the walls and provided welcome warmth after the bitter cold of the mountain night. James knelt beside her, his hands gentle as he examined the cuts and scratches that covered her arms and face. His touch was clinical but tender, and Ruth found herself studying his profile in the firelight. "I am sorry," she said suddenly, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "I am sorry for what I said the other night, for running away when you were only trying to be kind to me." James looked up from his examination, his expression serious but not angry. "You have nothing to apologize for," he said quietly. "I should not have pushed you when you were not ready to hear what I was trying to tell you." Ruth shook her head, frustrated by his continued kindness. "You were not pushing," she said, her voice growing stronger. "You were offering me something I thought I could never have again, and I was too frightened to believe it could be real." James was very still, his hands resting lightly on her arms as he searched her face in the flickering light. "What are you saying, Ruth?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. Ruth took a shaky breath, knowing that this might be her only chance to tell him what she should have said days ago. "I am saying that I was wrong to run from you, wrong to assume that you could not see past these scars. I am saying that I have been falling in love with you since the day you offered me sanctuary." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with emotion and possibility. James stared at her for a long moment, his expression cycling through surprise, hope, and something that might have been wonder. "Ruth," he said, reaching up to cup her scarred cheek with infinite tenderness. "You beautiful, brave, impossible woman. Do you have any idea what you do to me? His thumb traced the line of scar tissue that ran from her temple to her jaw, the same gesture he had made by the fireplace, but with none of the hesitation. This time, Ruth did not pull away. Instead, she leaned into his touch, closing her eyes as she allowed herself to believe that this man could truly see her as beautiful. These scars, James continued, his voice soft but fierce with conviction, they are part of your story, part of what makes you the strongest person I have ever known. They do not diminish your beauty, Ruth. They enhance it. Ruth opened her eyes to find James looking at her with an intensity that took her breath away. There was desire in his gaze, but also something deeper and more lasting. Love, she realized with a shock of recognition. James, she whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. I do not know how to do this. I do not know how to trust that this is real. James leaned forward, pressing his forehead against hers in a gesture of such intimate tenderness that it made her heart ache. Then let me show you, he said, his breath warm against her lips. Let me spend the rest of my life proving to you that you are worth loving, scars and all. When he kissed her, it was with a reverence that bordered on worship. His lips were soft against hers, moving with gentle patience, as if he had all the time in the world to convince her of his sincerity. Ruth felt something inside her chest unfurl like a flower opening to the sun. She kissed him back with all the pent-up longing of the past weeks, her hands tangling in his dark hair as she pulled him closer. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard, their faces flushed with desire and emotion. I love you, Ruth said, the words coming easily now that she had found the courage to speak them. I love you, James Ramos, and I want to spend whatever time we have left building something beautiful together. James smiled then, the expression transforming his weathered features. I love you too, he replied, pressing another soft kiss to her lips. I love you, and I am going to marry you, and we are going to raise that child together. But their moment of peace was interrupted by the sound of voices outside the bunkhouse, closer than they should have been, and filled with the satisfaction of men who had finally tracked their quarry to ground. James was on his feet instantly, his hand moving to the gun at his hip as he positioned himself between Ruth and the door. Stay down, he said quietly, his voice carrying calm authority. Whatever happens, do not try to help me. Think of the baby and stay safe. 3 men entered the small room, their faces hard with determination and their hands resting on the weapons at their sides. Ruth recognized one of them from town, a rough-looking character who worked for Thompson. Well, well, the leader said, his voice carrying mock surprise. James Ramos, the mountain man himself. We heard you might be up here with something that belongs to Mr. Thompson. James stood perfectly still, his hand hovering near his gun, but not yet drawing it. The lady is under my protection, James said calmly. She owes Thompson nothing, and she is going nowhere with you tonight. The leader chuckled, a sound devoid of humor. That is not really your decision to make, friend. The lady has debts that need paying. Ruth watched in terror as the tension in the room ratcheted higher, each man waiting for someone else to make the first move. The explosion of movement, when it came, was so sudden that Ruth barely had time to register what was happening. The leader reached for his gun, just as James drew his own weapon with lightning speed. The sound of gunfire filled the small room, deafeningly loud in the confined space, and Ruth screamed as she saw James stagger backward from the impact of a bullet. But James was still standing, still fighting, and Ruth realized that his wound was not immediately fatal. Ruth knew she should stay hidden, but watching the man she loved fight for his life against impossible odds was more than she could bear. Her hand closed around a piece of firewood from the couch beside the hearth. Ruth rose from behind the bed with the piece of firewood clutched in both hands, her heart pounding so hard she could barely hear over the sound of her own pulse. James was grappling with one of the remaining men, while the other circled them, looking for an opportunity to get a clear shot. The man with the gun finally found his opening, raising his weapon to take aim at James's back while he was distracted by his opponent. Ruth did not think, did not hesitate. She simply moved, bringing the piece of firewood down on the gunman's wrist with all the strength she possessed. The man howled in pain and fury as his weapon went flying across the room, his attention turning to Ruth with murderous intent. But before the man could lay hands on her, James was there, his fist connecting with the man's jaw with a sound like breaking wood. The sudden silence that followed was almost as shocking as the violence that had preceded it. Ruth and James stood in the middle of the destroyed room, both breathing hard and staring at each other across the space that separated them. James, she said, dropping the piece of firewood and moving toward him with shaking hands. You are hurt. Let me see. James caught her hands in his grip warm and reassuring despite the pain she could see in his eyes. It is not as bad as it looks, he said, though his voice was strained. The bullet went through cleanly. They held each other in the flickering firelight, surrounded by the evidence of violence but safe for the moment in each other's arms. We cannot stay here, James said after a moment. Thompson will send more men when these do not return. Ruth nodded, understanding the implications even as her heart sank at the thought of more running. Where can we go? She asked. James was quiet for a long moment, his arms tightening around her. There is a place, he said finally. A cabin even more remote than mine, higher in the mountains where no one will think to look for us. It will be a hard journey, but it may be our only chance. Ruth pulled back to look at his face, seeing the worry and determination written in the lines around his eyes. How long would we have to stay hidden? Until spring, at least, James replied honestly. It will not be easy, Ruth. The cabin is small and isolated, and we will have to live on what supplies we can carry. But we will be together and we will be free. The prospect of months of hiding in the wilderness was daunting, but Ruth found that the thought of facing it with James made it seem not just bearable, but almost appealing. Then we go, she said simply. Tonight, before anyone else comes looking for us. They spent the next hour gathering supplies and preparing for the journey ahead. The trail to the higher cabin was treacherous in the darkness, winding through narrow passes and across exposed ridges where the wind cut through their clothes like knives. They walked through the night and into the early hours of dawn, climbing steadily higher into country that seemed untouched by human presence. The cabin, when they finally reached it, was everything James had promised and more. It was smaller than his main residence but solidly built, with thick log walls and a stone chimney. As the fire caught and began to warm the small space, Ruth felt some of the tension leave her shoulders for the first time in days. They were safe, at least for now, hidden away in a place where Thompson and his men would never think to look for them. James sank onto the edge of the bed with a grimace, his wound clearly causing him more pain than he wanted to show. Ruth moved to his side immediately, her hands gentle as she helped him remove his torn shirt so she could properly examine the injury. The bullet had indeed passed through cleanly, leaving a neat hole in the muscle of his shoulder that was painful but not life-threatening. Ruth cleaned the wound as best she could, then rebandaged it with strips of cloth. You need to rest, she said when she had finished. That wound will not heal properly if you do not give it time. James caught her hand as she started to move away. Only if you rest too, he said. You have been through as much as I have, and you are carrying a child besides. They lay together in the growing warmth of the cabin, not sleeping but simply holding each other and processing everything that had happened. The silence between them was comfortable, filled with unspoken understanding. It was James who finally broke the silence. I have been thinking about what you said earlier, about not knowing how to trust that this is real. Ruth turned her head to look at him. What about it? She asked softly. I think I understand why you find it hard to believe that someone could love you as you are, he said finally. The world has not been kind to you, and you have learned to expect rejection and cruelty. Ruth felt her throat tighten with emotion as he continued. But I need you to understand something, Ruth. When I look at you, I do not see damaged goods or a charity case. I see a woman who lost everything and still found the strength to keep going. I see someone who protected her unborn child at the cost of her own safety. He turned on his side to face her, his dark eyes serious and intent. I see the most beautiful woman I have ever known, and those scars you are so ashamed of are part of what makes you beautiful. They are proof of your courage, your resilience, your refusal to let life defeat you. Ruth felt tears spring to her eyes at his words, but for once they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. She had spent so many months believing that the fire had taken away everything that made her worthy of love. I love you, she whispered, the words carrying all the emotion she could not express any other way. I love you, and I want to build a life with you. James smiled then, the expression transforming his weathered features. And I love you, he replied. I love you, and I am going to marry you as soon as we can find someone to perform the ceremony. They spent the rest of the day resting and planning for the weeks ahead. As evening approached, they prepared a simple meal from their supplies and sat together by the fire to eat. The conversation was easy and comfortable, ranging from practical matters to shared memories and dreams for the future. When it came time to sleep, they laid together on the narrow bed with a naturalness that belied the short time they had known each other. Ruth drifted off to sleep, feeling safer and more content than she had since before the fire. The weeks that followed passed in a rhythm of quiet domesticity that Ruth had never thought she would experience again. The cabin became truly theirs as they settled into routines that accommodated both their needs and the limitations imposed by their isolation. The first snowfall came early, blanketing their small valley in pristine white. Ruth stood at the cabin's single window, watching the flakes drift down through the pine branches, and marveled at how different her life had become. James came up behind her as she watched the snow, his arms encircling her gently. Beautiful, he murmured, though Ruth suspected he was not talking about the weather. The child she carried had begun to move more frequently, and James delighted in feeling the small kicks and turns. They had talked often about the baby during the long evenings by the fire, making plans and sharing dreams about the child they would raise together. One evening, as they sat together by the fire working on their respective projects, James set down his carving tools and looked at Ruth with an expression of such tenderness that it made her breath catch. I have something I want to ask you, he said, his voice carrying a nervous quality she had rarely heard from him. Ruth set aside her sewing and gave him her full attention. What is it? She asked gently. James took a deep breath, reaching into his pocket and withdrawing something small and gleaming. It was a ring, simple but beautiful, carved from wood but polished to a warm golden sheen. Ruth Collins, James said, his voice growing stronger. Will you marry me? Will you be my wife and let me be a father to your child and build something lasting with me in these mountains we both love? Ruth stared at the ring for a long moment, overwhelmed by the emotion behind the gesture. James was offering her not just marriage but partnership, not just security but love. Yes, she whispered, her voice thick with tears of joy. Yes, James Ramos, I will marry you. James slipped the ring onto her finger with reverent care, his own eyes bright with unshed tears. They held each other then, sitting by the fire in their mountain cabin, while snow fell softly outside and their future stretched ahead of them, bright with possibility. The ceremony itself took place 3 weeks later when a traveling preacher, making his winter rounds, agreed to perform the service in their small cabin. It was a simple affair, with only the minister as witness, but Ruth had never felt more beautiful or more loved. When spring finally arrived and the snows began to melt, Ruth and James made the decision to return to his original cabin. The danger from Thompson had passed. They learned from a supply run to a distant trading post. The baby was born on a warm day in early summer, when the wildflowers were blooming in the meadows around their home. Ruth held her daughter for the first time and marveled at the perfect tiny features. James wept when he first held the child, his weathered hands gentle as he cradled the small bundle. She is beautiful, he whispered, just like her mother. As evening fell and they sat together on the porch of their mountain home, watching the stars emerge in the clear sky above, Ruth reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. She thought of the night she had fled through the forest, terrified and alone, believing that her life held nothing but struggle and sorrow. Nobody had wanted the scarred pregnant widow, it was true, but James Ramos had seen past the surface to the woman beneath, had kissed every scar and claimed her as his own, had built with her a love that was stronger than fear or shame. In finding each other, they had discovered that true love was not about perfection, but about acceptance, not about hiding damage, but about celebrating the courage it took to survive and thrive despite life's hardest blows.